Tēnā tātou katoa, no mai haere mai I tēnei ata ātāhua. Welcome everybody on this fine and frosty morning to the Coastal Hazards Clifton to Tangoio Joint Committee. We'll kick off with karakia.
Yes, if I may. Do we have the words up there again?
Oh, do you want to do that? Okay.
Yeah. The words were up there. Oh, you can't see them anyway, they're too far away.
Yes, for you.
Yeah, well, this is just to echo the sentiments of Hayley, and it is a beautiful day and a frosty morning, which is it's good to wake up to. So we karakia tātou, we'll just do the Māori side because you can all read the English perfectly. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga, kia mā kina kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. E hi ake ana te atukura, he tio, he huka, he hauhu, ti hei,
Mauri ora.
Mauri ora tātou.
Kia ora. Do we have any, we have one apology from the chair, Giraffe.
Evelyn Rutten.
And Evelyn Ratma. Do we have any further apologies?
Just through the chair, I've had a text from Tanya Hockman's asking if someone could send the link through so she can join in.
And our chair, Giraffe, is expecting to join via Zoom, so he might pop in at some stage. He's travelling this morning. So I'll ask for a mover of the apologies. Moved by Councillor Redstone, seconded by Councillor Price. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Carried. Oh, against? Carried. Any notices by management?
No, not today.
Now I've got some brief housekeeping to run through. So this meeting is being live streamed on Council's Facebook page and recorded for viewing at a later date on our YouTube channel. In an earthquake, drop, cover and hold, and if the shaking is long or strong, when the shaking subsides, leave the building through the nearest exit and proceed immediately towards Napier Hill along Dalton Street to Tiffin Park, continuing up the steps to Cameron Road. Very detailed. If an emergency alarm sounds, immediately evacuate the building through the nearest exit and proceed to the assembly area on the grass at the corner of Dalton and Vaultier Streets. Emergency exits are clearly signposted. Toilets are located down the hall to the left of the chamber entrance. Right. Do we have any conflicts of interest? There being none, we'll move on to our first paper.
Confirmation of the minutes.
Can I have a mover for the confirmation of the minutes from our meeting held on the 12th of May? Thank you, Malcolm Dixon, and seconded by Zan Harding, Councillor Harding. Right, now our first item meeting, the Council Hazards Management Interim Response Plan. You're gonna...
Thank you, Chair. So really just to cover this, Simon will just go through the detail and we're happy to answer any questions, but the key purpose of this paper is to acknowledge while the strategy is being put in place, there is business as usual activities occurring. It sort of describes the various responsibilities and also acknowledging this is more important than ever because we have had to defer the consultation around the Hawke's Bay Regional Council taking on proposed new activities. So that will now occur next year. So for the next year or so, we're extending that business as usual through. And part of the reason is we need to preserve the decision rights of councils and also preserve the public consultation, and staff can't automatically, invoke an intent, and so we need to be clear on the responsibilities or the sort of business as usual going forward. So that's what the paper outlines. I'll hand to Simon to cover off any other salient points, and then really happy just to answer any questions.
Thank you, Chris. So just probably a couple of extra points from me. One is that this was last discussed just before the elections last year. I know councillors were very keen to see something more clear, I suppose, in place to guide what is done in response to emerging coastal hazards issues as they come up, and this sort of awkward space between now and when the strategy itself is actually adopted. It's been a long journey, as we all know, and whilst the strategy has always had the approach that its development won't slow down or affect what already happens as coastal hazards matters arise and are responded to, there was the sense that there was a bit of lack of clarity on who would do what and sort of when and what's possible while the strategy itself is developed. So this plan is intended to fill that gap. In terms of the document itself, really it goes through, probably the best way to describe it is at the very end of it, the last page is 8 key actions that it kind of distills right down to. And those are largely business as usual, but also trying to do a bit more around the monitoring side. So we're looking at doing sort of more active monitoring, both through the council, but also supporting community-led monitoring, so we can get a better idea of what's changing out there on the coast. One of the new initiatives is the use of a tool called Coast Snap, which is it's like a citizen science type tool. We've discussed at this table before, but it's a sort of a cost-effective way of installing a camera cradle on the beach. People can use their cell phones, they put it in the cradle, take a photo, upload it, and that creates a record of the coast at that point in time, and that's repeated time and time again, and it builds up a picture of how the coast is changing over time. There's also a suggestion for the councillors to investigate expanding the preemptive consents that are in place now at Home Moana that Hastings has to move the beach around to fill in holes in the crest, and then maybe merit in looking at extending that consent further north and south just to help manage things in the meantime. So it's really a combination in this plan of being clearer about how things are currently managed, plus a few sort of new initiatives to help respond to things as they arise. The last thing to note is that there might be a few final tweaks to this as it rounds out to the various council staff, but it's sort of 99% there. I know I had some feedback from Graham Hanson that I haven't quite built through this yet, just to signal that, but otherwise the plan will be sort of a living document to guide how things are managed between now and when the strategy itself is adopted. So that's the summary. I'm happy to take any questions from there.
Councillor Harding.
Kia ora, Chair. Thanks, Simon, for that. So, all very sensible to me to have some interim agreed structure for monitoring change and dealing with any incidents. What I wanted to talk about was the potential overlaps in there and just the clarity around that monitoring. So, in my head, my first response is that, and looking at the experience that we've had with the cyclone, that in principle I thought remote monitoring might be an option for this, and it may be that, so as your satellite-based monitoring, and that would pick up, shoreline recedings. What it might not pick up, and this might be part of the issue, is if there are holes and crests and that sort of thing. So is it the case that we really do need that sort of eye-level picture to pick up the full suite of potential issues, or is this something that remote monitoring can do for us?
So I think remote monitoring is a tool, and I guess the team is consistently looking at the best ways to undertake that. We do have a whole raft of existing transects across the coast, so we'll continue to measure them through traditional methods. And I think this paper was primarily aimed at articulating the various responsibilities rather than how the organisation will execute those responsibilities. So I think it's clear that the Regional Council has that role in continuing to monitor the beach crest, and I think that's a question of how we do that. And that's probably not a consideration for this paper, but it is a consideration for the Regional Council.
So it just seems that we don't have actual clarity at the moment about how we monitor. You take a transect's a point in time, and it looks, and presumably it looks at distance from the sea level, however you mean, but also the profile going backwards, and maybe looking down from the sky can't tell you that. Maybe it can't, but it's only a point. It's only whereas I mean, the beauty of remote sensing is you get a view of everything to a resolution. Anyway, so point is, we've got overlap and we've got no decision here about how we're going to monitor, and we've got some potentially overlapping suggestions. So there's two things to resolve here. One is that we don't have clarity about what the monitoring is going to look like, so I want to know what that process is going to be, but also to avoid overlapping.
So I can say there is absolute clarity on how the monitoring is done. We haven't presented that here in this paper. So the Regional Council has been monitoring the coast for 30 years, and we're going to continue that methodology. We've got a good record, and the citizen science is, or the Coast Snap is complementary and engaging with the community rather than being a primary method. So we've got our traditional transects and measurements. We've got the opportunity to involve the community through citizen science, which will provide some useful detail. And I think the question on how the Regional Council could change or improve its monitoring is a question for the Regional Council. This paper is purely around accountabilities for different activities, because to really clarify that if an intervention is required, it is currently the District Council who maintains that responsibility until a formal consultation and decision has been made to change that. And because of I guess we've got memorandums of transition and agreements in principle, there's sort of a level of greyness. And so this paper is supposed to, I think, set the clear responsibilities out. And I guess probably happy to talk to you outside of this about how we actually do the work and whether there's opportunities for improvement. But we're not saying here that responsibility sits with anyone else, it sits with the Regional Council.
Okay. No, just pardon me, but there is a level of greyness in here, and that there are proposals about monitoring, but no finality of that. And some of those proposals appear to overlap. For example, Coast Snap versus fixed cameras. Right? So it's just not very clear at the moment on the basis of their report.
I think the point for this one is this is about who's doing what, and as Regional Council, you guys can work out how you do your what. Councillor Redstone, you had a question?
Thank you, Chair. Just when you mentioned about the consent for pulling the shingle up onto the crest being extended, I wondered if it also can be tweaked to include pulling shingle up from below the mean high tide, because we had an issue with the cyclone where there was a lot of shingle in one or two places and a little bit in other places, so it couldn't be actually elevated. And I have to say compliments to the guy who did the work. He did a fantastic job of that beach replenishment. So.
Thanks, Anne. I think we can certainly do that. Intent is to look at even beyond just that activity, but is there anything else we could do that hasn't got a significantly high consenting barrier that's kind of practical to put in place? And if that includes looking at perhaps bringing shingle in from below that tide line, let's look at that. I'm not sure what extra consents that might trigger, but the idea is to do as a first sweep what makes sense to do, so we can have a look at that and report back where we land on that question.
That would be good, because in my view, and watching on a daily basis, the shingle comes and goes every day anyway, so when it's available, it's really good to grab it. Thank you.
Councillor Corbyn?
Thank you, Chair. I'm looking at action point 8, where any council determines to undertake a physical intervention under this plan, write a letter to the Joint Committee. Under the Memorandum of Transition, if the council wants that to be included in the assets that are transferred, they need to, is it seek approval from Regional Council or?
Consult with.
Consult with, yeah. So I think that should be expanded to recognise that.
Thanks, that's easily to do, yes, a good point. I mean, I guess the idea with that report back loop is that this community is aware of what's happening out there, but you're right, the MOT is explicit that, and TAs don't have to do it, but if they do want that asset transferred in future, then that would make sense to do so. That's what the MOT sets up. So I think we'll just add a clarifying statement that there's also a consultation under the MOT required with HBRC.
Thank you.
Okay.
I have a procedural question. Typically with these documents that affect the other councils, we have a recommendation that goes to the other council for approval. The recommendation in this paper seems to be that we can essentially adopt it ourselves. What's the thinking around the approval process for this, given that you said it's a living document as well?
So the way that it's been crafted is it's up to the joint committee for sort of endorsement, is the words we've used. The idea is that it's really more of an operational document for staff to help guide what they're doing as between them and also communicate out to the community on what they're up to. So there's no significant new spend or significant new activity. It's more bringing clarity to what's already done and a few more initiatives. So it really is quite operational.
Okay.
I guess why it's been brought up here is that there was an express interest in how this stuff is managed between now and adoption.
Okay.
So that's why we're not seeking it to be recommended or adopted per se, more just endorsed, and
Okay.
staff are going to carry it forward as an operational document.
And then there'll be a communication plan that this gets to our staff, I suppose.
Yeah, so I guess on staff of each organisation have already contributed to this. It reflects, by and large, what already happens, but it just clarifies that. Obviously, there's some new initiatives in there around CoastCam that the Regional Council were already working towards. So staff have been engaged, and I guess we, after each joint committee, there's a report that's written that goes back to each of the councils for information. Because there's no new costs or responsibilities for councils, we wouldn't expect that it would go through a separate decision process at each council.
Brilliant. Is there any further questions? Welcome to Tanya online. Can I have a mover and a seconder for the paper? Thank you, Councillor Corbyn. Seconder. Thank you, Councillor Dixon. There's it,
I'd like
two
it from
from
a
the-
different council, please. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Councillor Price. Do you have any discussion on the item? Do you have anything you want to say to the item? All right, all those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Right, item 4, adaptation thresholds development report.
I can speak to that one, Chair.
Send that to Simon.
So this has been discussed with this committee before, but just trying to think of, I think it might have been pre this current term. So as you're aware, we have these recommended pathways from the panels with a short, medium and long-term step in each phase. But those pathways aren't currently adaptive. So we've got no way of knowing when we should shift to the next step in the pathway or if it's even the right step beyond that kind of short-term action. So one of the sort of work streams we've got is a signals, triggers and thresholds work stream, which is we will build in this adaptive methodology so that we know signals give you the early warning of a change. The trigger is when you've hit a point, you've got to decide to take action, and the threshold's the stuff you want to avoid happening. So if we do our job well, we'll define the thresholds and we'll never hit them. So this thresholds report is the first step in that process, is to find the situations we're trying to avoid by taking action through the strategy. The report that's attached to the item is, I guess, really a summary of the process we've been through to develop thresholds, working with community members and council asset managers and others. I would say it's not widely consulted on. It's more of a sort of a focus group with panel members type development process. So there is a wider consultation step required to confirm these. But the idea is they provide that bedrock situation of if we do our job, we'll never experience these thresholds on the coast, in theory. The last thing to note is that, to work, we've got to have signals and triggers that support these thresholds so we know when we're tracking towards them. Had a big debate at TAG about how far we go down that development process until thresholds are being consulted on. And the decision is at this stage we're going to pause development until we have tested these thresholds with the wider community through the notification process next year. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is that the thresholds themselves are highly community derived, so it really is a reflection of how that community, or what they're willing to accept, I guess, in terms of impacts from coastal hazards, are very much a measure of that community's view on things. So we need to consult on it, and they might not be quite right yet because they may develop them internally with staff and with the focus group from that community. So there's a testing process required. And the second element is that, as you know, the current plan is for HBRC to take on implementation. And signals and triggers are a highly technical piece of work. So as one example, let's pick Whirinaki, if your threshold is to, not lose the road, you might define some trigger points that are set, say, for erosion at various distances out from that road. But quite where those points are set is quite technical. They've got to be set not too close, not too far away, in order to make sure you act in time. So it is a technical process, and it was felt that it was best led by the lead agency once that's confirmed. So there's kind of two reasons why signals and triggers are being deferred for now. So at this stage, the idea is to bring this report to you, to explain our process, to present the proposed thresholds, and if accepted, they will be slotted into the consultation document next year for testing with the wider community. So that's the summary. Happy to go any questions, Chair.
Are there any questions? Explained it very well. Councillor Harding.
Not a question.
Oh, have you got discussion?
Yeah, I would like to provide some feedback. I'm looking at table 3, page 15.
In the report itself?
In the report itself. So it's the table of thresholds and threshold measures for all units. And my observation, and if we go down to look at 50%, it's fifth point.
50%.
And there's a series of 3 thresholds there around community, or 2 of them are community perceptions, and the other one is a community experience around insurance. Make the point, particularly on the first one, that there's no objective measure of the extent of loss. So a loss of amenity could be a loss of 1% of amenity, just to really emphasise the issue. So I think those triggers they're hair triggers, potentially, with an element of subjectivity, and much stronger triggers than some of the others. And so I see potential issues with that. So I can't not point that out.
Yeah, thank you. I guess just in response, you've hit on a key challenge with this. So this whole methodology is derived from academia. And so, as we know, we are attempting to make that real in a real world context. And a lot of the stuff hasn't actually been done in real life yet. So determining thresholds, the academic literature suggests they should be cultural, environmental, social, the whole gamut. But obviously lots of those are highly subjective. So even that 50% figure, that's subjective. Should it be 30%, 80%? I mean, this is just a point in time. Where we've landed on this is, I think the best way to manage it is to have like a package of thresholds. Some might be hit, some might not, but it's the idea of having a range of indicators out there that you're monitoring for. None will be perfect, but it's trying to get, I guess, a broader view than just looking at economic costs and impacts and what's happening physically in the environment. Try to be a bit broader than that. So they are definitely imperfect, but the idea is to get the kind of richer picture of what's happening out there. I suspect these will be debated and probably changed more once we take them out to the wider community. There's also challenges around how do you even monitor something like that. Presumably it's through an annual survey, for example, but yeah, there are some quirks to work through with making this stuff practical. This is our first and best attempt at a set of thresholds that are practical. There's still signals and triggers still to come. So it's not a direct answer, but that's kind of the flavour of what's sitting in behind this.
And presumably, you ultimately you can't look at thresholds in isolation. You have to look at the whole system as a package and make sure that and know how, and kind of test, at least do some sort of bench testing of how the system will work. So as you say,
Absolutely.
the number of triggers, it may mean that 3 out of 5 triggers or thresholds have to be reached to
Exactly. That's right.
for a consequence, for example.
That's right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good discussion. Is there any other points anyone would like to raise? Okay, I'll call for a mover.
Happy to move.
Thank you, Councillor Harding. Second for Anne Redstone. Oh, sorry, Tanya. Was your hand up with a comment? Yep. Far away.
Yes, sorry. Thanks for the good report there, Simon. I just had two questions. One was on page 6 in terms of signals, and it might not be for amendment in this report, but to be picked up later. So the signals are the early warnings. Can you see that diagram there, figure 1? In the report, sorry.
Just flicking pages, figure 1. Okay, yes, I found that.
Yeah, so just we've got some cultural indicators there, and we've got, for example, loss of taonga, urupa or marae. But if we're talking about warnings, I'm just trying to be a bit more specific here that we're not waiting for the actual loss. We're looking at some threat to taonga, urupa or marae.
Exactly right. So that this is a diagram that's come from academic literature. It's actually wrong, in my view, and you've picked out why it's wrong. So to me, those are actually more like thresholds, more like thresholds, particularly for that cultural indicators one. So that isn't a signal at all. It's sitting in the wrong spot. So
okay, no, that's all right. I just wanted to make sure we were on the same page. And then going back to figure 3, table 3, I think it is. Sorry, the one we were just talking about.
Oh yes. Mm-hmm.
I understand there's the whole of coastline thresholds, but we had some very specific ones related to impacts on mahinga kai, rocks and reefs that are used for collection of kaimoana. Where is that, and who would be monitoring that? Where is that in this table?
It's missing. Is a short answer.
Okay.
Part of the reason for that is that in the development process of these, we were re-engaging with the community panel members who have come back to help us. As I think you're aware, we weren't able to get any of the mana whenua reps back, and there's a bit of a backstory as to why that was the case, but it is certainly a weakness in the report as it stands. We have stood up the Mātauranga Māori work stream in large part because of that missing, not just in this bit of work, but across the strategy. So I would expect, more than hope, I would expect that as that work stream advances, we can filter back through and start to build up some of those gaps. But in my view, that is absolutely a missing piece, and it's quite likely going to be where we have those unit-specific thresholds. I'm mindful of the Urupa North Shore Road, I think, as one example where you would want to have a threshold relevant specific to that, I imagine. But because we haven't spoken to Pitani Marae about their views on that, do they want to protect it? Do they want to move it? That's not been resolved. We haven't sort of had a go at guessing what a threshold might be. It's just currently a gap.
Kapai, so those, how do we, I can't remember what we called them, but those recommendations, when we concluded the draft strategy, that large report, and there was some specific recommendations, and one of them was to talk to Petani about the Urupa. But one of the other feedbacks from the tangata whenua members of the panels was that they preferred the coastline to remain natural, but if there was going to be structures or interventions, then they wanted to make sure that they had no impact on mahinga kai. So, I mean, that's a specific comment or, recommendation that came through that report. We just need to make sure those couple, even though we haven't consulted, that those couples are actually signalled in these kinds of thresholds that we might be considering. I think it's important, even though we haven't had the consultation. But that one about the not impacting mahinga kai was agreed by the tangata whenua, and that is something that would come up potentially as a result of ongoing renourishment, at West Shore, affecting northern rocks and reefs out towards Tangoio.
Yeah, it's interesting. So just two thoughts in response. One is I think I think you did right. We should actually, in this report, make a little addition. I think in section 5, just to note that these thresholds have not been developed alongside mana whenua, tangata whenua, and therefore there are some missing bits in here, and that needs to be resolved, just so we don't lose that placeholder. But the second interesting point you've raised is these thresholds are very focused on avoiding the effects of a hazard occurring. They actually haven't contemplated the adverse effects of action taken in response to avoiding that hazard. I imagine that would fall more into the triggers piece, but that's just my own thinking at the moment. One example might be when you get to a point where you're spending so much on nourishment that it's no longer sustainable. So that's like a reason to change. It's not a hazard reason to change, it's a mitigation action reason to change. Mm-hmm. But you're right, there may well be space for some environmental triggers to drive a change in action, because what you're doing now is causing too much adverse effect. So I'm just sort of thinking as I talk a little bit about how to respond to your question, but you've raised a good one. I think the action I wouldn't mind recorded is if we could note that an update's required to the thresholds report to identify that gap in the development process, and that thresholds specific to tangata whenua values needs to be included.
Yep.
So I'll do that, and then I'll ponder some more about the other matter you've raised and have a think.
Thanks, Simon.
Chair, I think if I could just add a point about how this whole thing is viewed in Mātauranga Māori terms, is that one of the simplest views is that land is considered the same whether it's above the water or below the water. It's land. Yeah, so we should treat them the same. That's why mahinga kai is important, because it's land, yeah.
So, we're looking,
Currently got a couple of people who've had a motion put about to accept this report.
right. Do we need to make a amendment to the recommendation to include the inclusion of Mātauranga? The mana whenua viewpoint? Yep.
Yeah, I think we can take that as, so I don't have to bring it back. We'll
I think that's
additional on that.
We typically deal with that as an action point, and we note that in the minutes, and can still pass this as is.
As is?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have a mover and a seconder.
Yep.
Is there any further discussion? Right, I'll put the motion. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried. Right, number 5, real options analysis of strategies to manage coastal hazards.
So I'll just hand over to Simon for the detail, but this was an opportunity to redo some of the previous work in terms of the real options analysis with some updated information. So I'll hand it over to Simon to talk through some of the key outcomes of that rework.
Thank you, Chris. So the first thing to note is I'm not an expert in real options analysis, so if there are detailed questions, I might have to write them down and come back to you. But it's been prepared by Infometrics, a guy called Adolf Strombergen, who's an expert in this methodology. It's essentially an advanced form of cost-benefit analysis. We used it back when the panels were coming up with the recommendations for the preferred pathways to make sure that we had considered costs and benefits, but also timing of response as part of recommending the final pathways. At that time, the analysis relied on some pretty coarse numbers coming into it, both in terms of the cost of the response of building and growing at home water, for example, and the cost of what retreat might be as an alternative. And so what we've done is, off the back of some work more recently, to update and make more accurate those costings, both for the short-term response, but also through the work by TNT, what the cost of retreat now looks like, which is more accurate than it was. We thought it worthwhile to revisit that earlier analysis to check if anything's changed. Does the new cost information mean that actually retreat makes more sense from an economic perspective rather than defending in the short term? So that's really the key question we're looking to answer. So Adolf has dusted off his earlier work. He has slotted in the new numbers that were provided on managed retreat and on the short-term actions. And really the short version is that it hasn't changed the outcome. So there's not a lot of debate here. It's more bringing it up for your awareness that we have done this kind of check back to make sure that our foundations are still solid. And analysis has proved out that actually the new information doesn't change the outcome, which is that the pathways as they stand, which is kind of this buying time by defending in the short to medium term, still makes sense from an economic perspective. So that is a summary. Last thing to note, if you do want to dive more into how this ROA system works and some of the analysis, we're happy to invite Adolf to a workshop with you. He wasn't available today, he's in Australia, but if that's of interest, we can line that up. If you're taking any questions.
Councillor Price?
I think that's a good idea that he comes to a workshop, because it is quite a bit subjective, is it? Or?
I wouldn't call it subjective. No, because it's relying on numbers that have an element of error in them, so they're estimates, right, coming in. So it's a model, so it's imperfect. But it is like it's a sophisticated cost-benefit analysis. So I wouldn't call that subjective, but there are elements of error in that by using estimates.
I'm probably saying what you're saying, but harsher word.
Maybe that's it.
Yeah.
But yeah, if you want to dive into it more, unfortunately, I'll struggle a bit to explain the ins and outs of it all. But if you'd like to dive into it, Adolf's more than happy to dial in and have a chat with you about what he's done both back then and now, and what it means for us as a committee.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sure, happy to do that.
Councillor Harding?
Question for Simon, if I can. So I'm looking at the report, page 6, and first paragraph. Question for Simon is, Simon, what do you think local authorities should take from the fact that this form of analysis does not look at change in ownership of assets, for example, in a managed retreat situation? So that paragraph, as I understand it, says that because the land hasn't, if land does not disappear but changes hands from, say, a local authority to private hands or vice versa, then there's no cost, there's no net cost, because there's a benefit, there's a national economic benefit and a national economic cost. It strikes me that that's not very helpful for a local authority in the situation that they're being forced to take on a cost for ratepayers. How should we think about that?
Can you point me to that paragraph again? Is it page 6?
Top of page 6.
Part of the analysis, it nets off at new land versus old land.
Yeah, right.
The methodology, probably more a question for Adolf.
Yeah, it is. Well, again, I hesitate because I haven't done the deep dive, but my immediate reaction would be a couple of things. One is I think this is just one data point for us to consider amongst everything else, right? It doesn't look at cultural, social elements. It's simply a cost benefit plus with a time component built in. So that's one element. The second is that I think how retreat is done and how it is funded at the scale we're talking about in this project isn't defined anywhere. We know that the government's working on this Climate Adaptation Act, which is billed as providing some answers to that. Last I heard, it won't be emerging this side of the elections, more likely some time down the track. But there may be some guidance coming out from government in the meantime to help with that. My own view from this project particularly is that local government actually hasn't got the tools, in my view, to fund and implement retreat at scale without central government involved. So how these things are funded is a huge question that we haven't got answers to, is the short answer, I suppose. I'm not sure that helps directly with your question, but I think it's a big issue for the country about how do we actually do this stuff at scale. And I think the risk for all of us is that because that's so ill-defined and so expensive, buying time through defence is always the most attractive option at the moment, because we've got really no practical alternative at scale in the next decade or so, in my view.
Thank you.
Any further questions or discussion? Rightio. I'll put the motion that we note the real options analysis of strategies to manage coastal hazards risks in Hawke's Bay report, and that no further action on real options analysis is required at this stage. Can I have a mover and a seconder, please? Thank you, Councillor Corbyn and Councillor Lambert. Any discussion on the paper? Right. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried. Right, item 6, project managers update.
So that's Simon. Take us through the key points.
Thank you, Chair. So there's two main bits. I guess I've got my usual project dashboard, which has all moved to green bar one, and the reason of that shift is really we've bought more time. So everything's less stressed than it was, but I've left the project timeline as red, really to just acknowledge that we're taking an awful long time to get the strategy out there. So I know there's a lot of frustration out there in the community. Some have lost faith or are losing faith this will deliver something useful. I think we should be very aware of that and keep a focus on the fact we are taking a long time. There are lots of good reasons why. I mean, there's lots of complexity in this. The cyclone's the latest reason for a delay, but I wanted to keep that red just to signal that risk. Otherwise, because we've got more time, all other work streams are tracking pretty well. The next part of the update talks about a comms and engagement plan. There's a few words there, but really the summary is we've been promising you a comms and engagement plan for a few meetings now. We haven't been able to get one pulled off, and the main reason for that is a capacity constraint within HBRC, who have been run off their feet in cyclone recovery, as you can imagine. So we have dialed in some external support for that. Rebecca Ashcroft from Frank Engagement is sitting back there. So she usefully was formerly with HBRC and was our comms advisor for this project. So it's not new for her. So Frank are now working on a comms and engagement plan to bring to you to guide how we'll engage externally really between now and when the strategy is notified in August next year. A key outcome really is to make sure that none of what goes out is a big surprise. It'll include engaging not only with the community more broadly, but also looking at how do we engage across the councils internally and with mana whenua alongside the Mātauranga Māori workstream. In the paper, there are some draft objectives, which I'm happy to discuss and test with you, just to give it a flavour of how that plan is developing. But just given timeframes, we haven't got the plan ready for you today. The idea is to refine it and bring it to the next meeting. Our next step is we have a stakeholder mapping workshop booked for, I think it's 28th, to make sure we've got all the right people identified through this plan and defined a bit more accurately how this works alongside engagement through the Mātauranga Māori workstream. So it's really a work in progress update, but happy to take any questions. Or Rebecca, is there anything you want to add to that summary? All covered? Okay. So
Looking forward to working on the project again. I'm glad to be back.
okay.
Welcome back.
Happy to take any questions.
Does anyone have any? Councillor Harding.
Sorry, stuck record. Simon, just a question around 13.3 formal consultation. Are you aware, and this is not, I'm only phrasing this as a question because I'm told that I don't ask enough questions and I make too many comments, but so I'm phrasing this as a question. Are you aware that of the proposal, I think it's still at the proposal stage for orders in council, an order in council to modify and reduce requirement for auditing and the scope of our LTP?
Yes.
Right, thanks.
Yes, we are aware of that. Quite what it means for that step, I don't know, is a short answer. But yes, we're aware of that risk.
Wonderful, thank you.
Thank you.
Any further questions or discussion? Councillor Redstone? Oh, happy to move? Right, got a mover and Councillor Redstone, seconded Councillor Price. So I'll put the motion that we receive the project manager's update. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried. Right. Item 7, current coastal projects update.
Excellent, thank you, Chair. So this is our usual update of what's happening around the bay in terms of coastal projects. We have members of TAG in the audience there who can assist in answering questions. So we really just take this paper as read and happy to answer any questions on the paper.
Keith, Councillor Price, do you have a question?
Probably be able to pick which one I'm going to ask about. Is West Shore and North Street, where's that at, please?
So in terms of the consenting or the repairs?
Just
of the
to
barrier?
keep it, to give them protection.
Yeah. So my understanding is we've done some temporary works and we are contracting the permanent works. I don't know, David, do you have anything? We don't think we've got anyone from the projects team out there.
I can give a small update on. There's been the vegetable
Oh.
nourishment.
Sorry, can you please come up and use the mic for the people on Facebook?
And
So there's three parts while David's just getting ready. There's the temporary works, then the more usual annual project that we do that's being sized up, and then of course there's the reconsenting of what's our longer term plan around that area. But David can probably give us an update.
Current repair of the seawall is happening. There was a little bit of drawback on the recent swell events just within the one last week. We agreed to do more top up on the seawall. Agreed a certain volume. I just don't know on the top of my head, and that is alignment with our usual annual nourishment for the seawall. So really, it's about a 5-week sort of range of work until it's done. And then the new alignment has been agreed that kind of encroaches on NCC land a little bit further, and the dimensions and alignment was the design was provided from our engineering team. Projects team is carrying out the work.
Just further to that is, so the concern is that we're getting a lake in there?
Yeah.
So with work, that'll go? Or, I know that when you get rain, it's got to go somewhere, but.
Yeah, so I think the key thing there is the team are actively working with staff from Napier City Council, and so there's the different responsibilities there where it's joint responsibility for the renourishment, but obviously Napier have that reserve, and so we're working together to resolve those issues. But ultimately it will drain, and I think Napier staff will have some firm views on the speed and how that should occur, but the team are working together. It's been quite challenging at the moment. Obviously, all of our organisations have a huge amount of work on, and we as Regional Council is stretched all the way from Wairoa down to Parongaho in terms of response, and so things are happening a little bit more slowly than they might if it was a more sort of targeted impact. But we're certainly aware of all the issues and working through them as fast as we can.
Thanks for that. That's a good, honest reply, which I'll be able to field some calls and answer. Thank you.
Councillor Corbyn.
Still on the Rangatira revetment and the point 3 there. We discussed the memorandum of transition requiring consultation. So my question is a letter from Napier to Regional Council considered as consultation?
So, the short answer is it's clearly not consultation. I think with the Rangatira revetment, one of the specific issues with that is it's been in the long-term plan for Napier City Council for a prolonged period. And the Regional Council obviously needs to respond to that letter, which we haven't done yet. We've had a bit of a merry-go-round of chief executives, and Dr. Nick Peters now here, so I'll be working with him to respond to that letter.
Just to tease that out then, do you feel like it's clear within Hastings and Napier councils what the requirements of consultation are?
Look, I think the key principle behind that consultation provision in the memorandum of transition is given that the proposed transition to the Hawke's Bay Regional Council, that there's a no surprises approach. And so under that memorandum of transition, there's the transfer of assets and debt and revenue potentially to the regional council should it go through. And so it really is that no surprises approach. And so the regional council can see what's coming and may have a comment back. Obviously with Rangatira, the timing around that, it was in the LTP, it was an agreed project. The line of sight on that project was quite clear. But obviously for different projects, particularly new projects, we'd probably want to see a more robust level of discussion between organisations, acknowledging that decisions made by one organisation could transfer revenue, debt and assets to another. So I think it's just, that was the spirit in which that clause was put in.
Brilliant. You have a follow-up?
I thought it was a bit more than no surprises.
Yep.
I thought it was regional council actually agreeing with what was happening and saying at some time in the future we're prepared to take that over as our responsibility. No surprises could be, hey, we're going to do this.
Yeah.
And you're thinking, I wouldn't do that. I'd do something different.
Yeah. So, Councillor, you are correct. And the other thing to note is that there's specific assets written into that memorandum of transition. So potentially, as you have suggested, any new assets is an agreement between the organisations. So you are correct. It's much more no surprises. It is certainly that there's an agreement going forward, and I guess. If there's not good process in place, it increases the risks that certain assets could potentially not be transferred because they're outside of the terms of that memorandum.
Councillor Redstone, just have a question.
Thank you, Chair, I do, and I think it's probably for Chris. Just looking at the Marae-Totara River at Tiawana, scope of proposed action to construct a revetment wall. I'm just wondering if you can flesh that out a little bit for us, Chris, because I know that there's a little bit of pushback about whether or not the Marae-Totara was an acerbator in that flooding event.
Who's responsible?
Yeah, so I might ask Mark. Certainly, we've had staff at those public meetings working through the issues. In terms of coastal structures, that would be more within the domain of the Hastings District Council. So that's why I've sort of just looking at Mark to see if he's got any comment.
No, I don't.
No?
Just come and use the mic for your non-comment, Mark.
But I think the key comment there is discussions ongoing with the landowner representatives around a range of options, and so they'll be presented to the wider community later on. So it's a work in progress, I think, is the thing to take out of this report.
Thanks. What I'm actually asking is the revetment to protect the river or to protect the car park?
So I'd say that rivers don't need protection. It's people who need protection.
It does say in here to repair the banks.
Yeah, so there is some erosion of the banks, and this is where it's a cusp between the Marae-Totara scheme, which is the regional council in terms of that particular river and some drainage around there. There's also the erosion that's occurred, and we need to work together to work out what the plan is. So it could be worded slightly awkwardly in there, but effectively teams and community really working together, and we've got nothing specific to report here in terms of outcomes.
And I also wanted to know, just interested to know whether the Marae-Totara actually came along adjacent to the beach. Did that cause the problem? If it had gone straight out at the river mouth, would it have been a different outcome?
So I think that's a
question.
Very difficult question to answer. So I can't answer that specifically here. And it's a bit of a hypothetical as well. At the end of the day, in major events, rivers are where they are. We work very hard, particularly with river mouths, to open them up and direct them in certain areas. And for a lot of Hawke's Bay rivers, we don't have permanent groins or ways of fixing the mouths, and so it is a dynamic environment. And so I think part of any project is understanding about living with rivers and having resilience to different sorts of conditions, rather than an expectation that they'll all stay exactly how they are on a fine day. So that's what we've got to work through with the community to build resilience into whatever
And
we do.
I think the views are coming from historical people as well, like Sir Rod Heaps, who used to have a tractor at the camp and they would open the river mouth straight out to stop that happening along the beach. So I hope that sort of conversation is going to be included because that might be the easy answer.
Yeah. Look, and it is, and I think we have, 18 or 19 river mouths that are managed. We have documents on how we do that, what the preferred arrangement is, what some of the critical triggers are for intervening with those rivers, and we're down there, every week we'd have a digger in a river mouth somewhere in Hawke's Bay. So we're actively in that space, and we'll continue to work with the community around how we can improve that and improve the overall resilience.
Thank you.
Any further questions or discussion on the paper? Right, I'll put the motion that we receive the current coastal projects update. Can I have a mover and a seconder? Moved by councillor Price, seconded by councillor Dixon. Did you want to speak to the paper? All right, I'll put the motion. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried. Right.
Okay. Coastal events, I think we have a presentation. So
Yes.
I think, Jose, are you presenting this item? So we'll ask Jose to come up. So there was a request, I think, at the last meeting to just provide a bit of a high-level summary across the region. What are some of the issues we're facing at our coastal margin as a result of the cyclone and some other recent swell events, and so Jose's along to just give us a bit of a high-level overview, and then we're happy to answer any questions from there.
Right, hi everyone. What I'm going to show you is what something we normally do at the regional council, which is prepare a report of any swell event. This particular one is about the cyclone Gabriel. So a little bit of the stats around it. The port buoy failed. They have two buoys at the same location. They both failed and they got rescued somewhere in Whirinaki. The wave height recorded there, it's one of the highest one recorded. But despite of that, the damages seen at the coast weren't that significant with respect to this high level of wave energy. Something interesting is that there's what was quite a bit of a storm surge due to the low pressure and winds. And so we had sort of a high level there of about 0.6 meters above the predicted tide. I'll probably better just show you the photos. This is a little bit of the graphs there. I think you can see them better here. So here we got a new buoy as well that we've been including as part of the enhanced coastal monitoring, which is located currently at West Shore. So that buoy didn't fail, but it dragged around 80 meters towards the northwest, but it recorded the peak of the waves there and continued recording. The port buoy and the forecast were quite good, actually, the forecast, but the port buoy failed at around the early hours of the morning, recording the peak wave height there. What else? Yeah, wind was pretty strong. The storm surge recorded, so this is the predicted tide in yellow, and in blue there's the average tide recorded at the port, so there's quite a bit of difference there. So that extra water level would have potentially created more problems. That also coincided with the peak or near the peak of the waves, which were at around about midnight. But saying that, despite of all that, the damages at the coast weren't that significant. They could have been a lot worse. So the effects that I've compiled and I saw after the event were quite a bit of erosion, and with exposure of this tire sort of hot dog protection at Tiawanga, which I wasn't aware of, that there were a lot of tires in this area. I knew that there were tires in the railway irons there. This is thanks to the aerial imagery, the post-cyclone aerial imagery, which is quite, it's been really good. Yeah, erosion at Tiawanga car park, which is still an issue as you just raised, and flooding in that area in Hamoana. Flooding and the breaching of the gravel band at West Shore. Lots of debris on the coast, as you know. Erosion at West Shore. That's the surf club at West Shore. That's the trajectory of our buoy, how it dragged along during the cyclone. That's your email. Yeah. So you had some, maybe you want to say it by yourself, but there's some of your photos there. You said that you had some trees falling in your property. Yeah. And yeah, and there was some beach scraping done by HDC after the cyclone.
Actually, HBRC Works Group, I think, did the work.
Yeah.
Did it very well for us.
Yeah, part of the HDC consent, and yeah, there's some water quality measurements there that are of interest for our science team, but not really relevant too much to coastal to the coastal processes, and yeah, so there's amount of debris on the coast that you're aware of, and yeah, the dynamics on the Esk river mouth as well. This is at Tiawanga, the erosion there, which you are aware. I think the erosion is getting really close to this lagoon, about to breach it, and that's partly caused by the storm and also the change in the course of the river around the mouth. Yeah, there's an erosion hotspot there in West Shore, which we are also working on with the project management team in order to extend the design, the construction of the Whakauri Rehab to include an extra length there of protection. So that's been, we're working with Becca on a proposal there to include that. Yeah, some changes here in erosion, the Esk river mouth as well. That's not too many coastal infrastructure here, but that's mostly, I would say, caused by the flooding of the river and not so much by coastal action.
I said, while you've got that one up, I was going to raise that issue. I've just having been on the property, the orchard property on the southern side of the river mouth there, and seen that they've lost a couple of acres of their orchard. So that it's quite dramatic, the amount of loss, yeah, on the southern side of that. Is there anything you can tell us about that in terms of any response that anyone can provide to that, or is that something that's just outside of the scope of any council or organisation to assist with?
I think, to be fair to Jose, that's probably not a coastal question. It's a Cyclone Gabriel response. And we have I would say, a significant number of locations around the whole of Hawke's Bay where river bank erosion and rivers finding new or old channels has altered the landscape. There's no obligation, I think, on the regional council to reconstitute the river where it was, apart from where it's in schemes with those objectives. And it's really challenging for a whole raft of landowners. And we're trying to provide advice as best we can, but also acknowledging we're fixing a lot of assets across the whole region. So I think we'll progressively be able to provide more advice and help landowners respond to those situations. We also, as part of, I guess, the response and funding from the Crown, put a provision up to the Crown for funding damaged private property. So we haven't been successful with that. So we're working around it, but we're not in a spot to deliver solutions right now.
Sure, understood, Chris. It was just an opportunity. We were looking at it.
Yeah.
And it's not quite coast, but well, the question is, where does the coast stop in terms of this analysis? But it's an obvious change that's outside of the scope of the joint strategy.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
One more photos here. Some photos provided here about some flooding at the Tiawanga Motor Camp, part of the fix, and yeah, some flooding at the beach road in Hamoana. There. It's also Hamoana, Grange Road. Photos from, yeah, Clifton Road. Yep, and that's what I got. Not sure if I missed something. I tried to compile as much information as I could after, yeah, I wasn't here for the cyclone actually, so I missed all the fun, but yeah. Anything else? Please flick it forward.
Open it up to some questions.
Councillor Redstone?
Yeah, thanks, Jose. I think you've covered it pretty well. Some of those flooding events were caused by stormwater issues. Some were caused by failure of the pumps, particularly down the end of Grange Road. There's groups of people working on those issues. The flooding itself was really interesting because we got up in the morning and noted I'd lost 12 40-year-old trees which had gone in all different directions. Nothing was consistent, but the water didn't turn up until 10 o'clock in the morning and it just rushed in. So, yeah, it wasn't from the inundation. The crest was washed into the drains, but the water came from stormwater generally, I think, and as far as the flooding went.
Yeah. So this is actually quite interesting because some of the assessments we've been doing, they're isolated. They consider either coastal flooding or river and runoff flooding, but the combination of the two, it's something that's, yeah, it's interesting to...
Very unusual. Thank you.
If there's no other questions or discussion, I'll put the motion that we receive and note the recent coastal event staff report. Can I have a mover and a seconder, please? Thank you, Councillor Corbyn. Thank you, Councillor Harding. Oh, yep. Was that a question, Tanya, or just to move? No, okay. Did you like to speak to the motion, Dawn? No. Thank you very much for your paper, Jose. And I'll put the motion. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried. Right. Thank you very much. And our final paper is the Phillip Actions Update. This is for you, Simon.
Simon might just take us through any key actions.
Happy to. So the first one is around scheduling some funding workshops with the joint committee. To update you on that, the TAG funding group has been meeting to kind of plan that out. We're looking to host a workshop with you perhaps in September, I think was a target, but I'll confirm that. So that is happening on a slightly slower track than it was when this item was first brought into being, but September is planned workshop with you on funding matters. Terms of reference, this next one has gone through. I just note, Chair, your question about tsunami. Is it worth discussing now?
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah.
So just to raise that the question's been asked, in the terms reference for this joint committee, we have 3 hazards. We've got inundation, erosion, and we have tsunami in there as well as technically within our purview. And Councillor Brown's quite rightly asked, should tsunami still be there? So I haven't got an answer per se, but do you want to speak to that question at all?
I suppose the question that was running through my head was, is it an administration process of going, well, tsunami is largely a social response around preparedness. There's no sort of, it's a sedum response rather than a physical landscape thing. However, there is the aspect of tsunami evacuation and whether we build big mounds or vertical evacuation towers, which you could argue is a construction type thing, which is more aligned with what we do. So one of the questions is whether that's enough for us to keep this in, and it's something that we advocate for within this committee. But then we had a further conversation around the broader work done with the coast and whether there's little bits of fragmented parts of work that are stepping up, that we should look at how we bring that closer together. For example, at Napier City Council, we're doing some work on inundation, but it's not done through this committee. And Hastings have some other examples that you mentioned before. So I suppose it's a question for the committee around what we want to do with the fact that we currently have tsunami in our terms of reference, but we're not consciously working on it. I think we either take it out or we look at including it, but then including it in our work.
And can I comment?
Yeah.
And look, there's probably a bit of middle ground. I think we need to be cognizant of any of the analysis around tsunami. So in that case, it's in that we want to be open to understanding any technical work around there, but acknowledging that in terms of physical protection from tsunami is something that we haven't built into this strategy. Because of the catastrophic nature of the event and the infrequency of the event. So it's same sort of question, but I think there's a bit of a nuance there.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be all or nothing, but certainly we need to be cognizant of that information. But you're right, we haven't. It hasn't been a cornerstone of our analysis and strategy.
Well, just one extra comment. One of the things that Chris has asked me to do is prepare a bit of a map of what's happening out there across the councils in terms of its hazard identification and response activity. So we know there is a Civil Defence Emergency Management Committee. There's also a Climate Action Committee. There are various projects happening within and through those and outside of those. So you've mentioned inundation. There's a groundwater study that Napier's leading. So Chris has asked me to kind of put a network map together, all the things that are happening, so we get a better bead on that. So if useful, I could bring that back to this committee to go, look, here is the picture of what the councils are doing in this space, and maybe that might help us debate a bit more about where tsunami best fits within that network and as part of this committee.
I think that sounds really practical. It's about having the lens of what the big picture is, but then knowing our niche and not stepping into others. Is there any other discussion on that?
So perhaps to the chair, just record that as an action, Peter, then I'll report back on that map, whatever we want to call it.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. I'll keep rolling through. So, oh yes, so this item 3 was actually a request from from Tanya Hotmans around having a better infographic or description of the process we've been through to put down the website to better communicate, I guess, our journey as a project. So just noting that's a work in progress, and we've tasked Frank with helping us prepare that. So it's not up yet to Tanya, but it certainly hasn't been lost from something we're working on. The current coastal project update, add West Story nourishment, consenting costs, home on a crest height and Raitota Rivers, that's all been done and reported on today. The coastal inundation assessment workshop, so you recall that Tonkin Taylor came to a previous workshop with this joint committee. The next step was to build in some more data post-cyclone that I think Napier had available to it, and then come back with a workshop. So that's a bit of a work in progress, but we haven't, we're trying to get that organised as a cross-council workshop. The Comms and Engagement update, I was asked to take a report to the HPRC Māori Committee and RPC as part of, I guess, shoring up some of our gaps and engaging with tangata whenua. So just so you're aware, I took an item to the Māori Committee last week, and I'll be taking the same item to the Regional Planning Committee next week. So just to keep them updated on where we're up to, with a particular focus on the Mātauranga Māori work stream. The Comms and Engagement produced a new newsletter, so Frank have been asked to do one post this meeting to keep us updated, which Rebecca I know has in her sites. The Comms and Engagement Plan, the next item, discussed already today as a work in progress through Frank, and will come to the next meeting. And the last one was on this interim response plan. So as mentioned, this committee was very keen for it to happen. It's now been through this committee, so is in motion, and we'll report back on implementation to future meetings.
Brilliant. Councillor Corbyn, any
Yeah,
question?
on the item 5, the coastal inundation assessment workshop, could you just say, I missed what you said.
Apologies, I was probably running too fast. So you might recall we had a workshop with Tonkin and Taylor. So this all came out of, I think, mostly Hastings District Council looking to get better data to inform their building consent process.
Yeah.
So TND had done a version 1 of the report specifically for the area within the strategy we're looking at, so Clifton to Tangoio. In that workshop, Napier raised that there was some more post-cyclone LiDAR that should be built into that, from my recollection. And that's like a work in progress. So the committee asked that it be reported back to a future workshop. So that's what's happening. Last I had heard about that, the workshop was still being found in terms of a date with councillors, but TNT, I think, have completed the extra work. I'm looking at Heather. Have I got that right?
I checked last week and that hadn't happened, but...
Hadn't, okay.
Yeah.
So it remains a work in progress, but our action is to bring, for TNT to come back to, I believe, a cross-council workshop with all 3 councils, and not this committee, but all 3 councils to come together to look at that study and interrogate it further with the new data having been built into it.
So when the data's built in, do you see it? Chris sees it? Who sees it? Or does it just get built in and then go to a Napier City Hastings District workshop?
Interesting question. So the project's being led by Hastings, but it is cross-council, but it's not actually a project within this strategy. So all the councils will get it because it's been a cross-council project. I'm sure, I'm looking at perhaps Mark now, I'm sure we could...
Yeah, so I think the process is the work was commissioned for a certain purpose, and that's the building consenting authorities purposes, and so all of the organisations joined up, so we had a consistent approach, which is really fantastic, but both Hastings and Napier will need to formally receive that information so their building consenting authorities can use it. So that's the primary purpose of that engagement. So it can happen separately or it can happen together.
Yeah.
And so I'm working with John Osh to just work through that process, because it was a bit unclear, because it had become an action out of the joint committee when really the work's been driven by the building consenting authorities, and we just had some oversight as a tag and as a committee. Does that help? Or?
It's still very unclear.
Right, okay. So maybe we could...
I think someone needs to say, yes, what was requested in terms of new information in the report has been included and looks right, and in a timeline set on it.
So since that hasn't happened, that's the first step, is for Tonkin and Taylor to include that additional information, and then we'll set it forward from there. So I think what we should do is just send out a bit of a note, a bit of mapping out the progression of that information. So I'll work with Josh on that.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Do we have any further questions on the paper or discussion? Right, I'll call for a mover and a seconder that we receive and note the follow-up actions update. Thank you, Tanya and Councillor Redstone. Any discussion? Right, all those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried. And as that is our last item, that brings the meeting to a close. Councillor Lambert, would you be able to close us with a karakia?
Of course, thanks, Hayley. Yep, me karakia tātou. Kia tau, kia tātou katoa, te atapai tō tātou ara kia ihu karaiti, me te aroha o te atua, me te whiwhinga tahitanga ki te wairua tapu, ake, amen.
Thank you.